Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, January 8th, 2025, and Senator Richard Black is back with us. Welcome back, Senator.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Let's get started with Donald Trump, Senator. We know that his team are mostly or dominantly captured by pro-Israelis in his cabinet. But yesterday, he published a video of Jeffrey Sachs talking about these endless wars in the Middle East, and which was so surprising to me. I want to know what's your take and what is the reason that Donald Trump has published this video, has tweeted this video. Let me.
And you may actually hear from grown-up reporters who are lying through their teeth or ignorant beyond imagining that, oh, the war in Syria, yes, Russia intervened in Syria. Well, do you know that that Obama tasked the CIA to overthrow the Syrian government, starting 4 years before Russia intervened? What kind of nonsense is that? And how many times did the New York Times report on Operation Timber Sycamore, which was the presidential order to the CIA to overthrow Bashar al-Assad? 3 times in 10 years. This is not democracy. This is a game. And it's a game of narrative. Why did the U.S. invade Iraq in 2003? Well, first of all, it was completely phony pretenses. It wasn't, oh, we were so wrong, they didn't have weapons of mass destruction. They actually did focus groups in the fall of 2002 to find out what would sell that war to the American people. Abe Schultzky, if you want to know the name of the PR genius. They did focus groups on the war. They wanted the war all the time. They had to figure out how to sell the war to the American people, how to scare the shit out of the American people. It was a phony war. Where did that war come from? You know what? It's quite surprising. That war came from Netanyahu, actually. You know that? It's weird. And the way it is that Netanyahu had from 1995 onward the theory that the only way we're going to get rid of Hamas and Hezbollah is by toppling the governments that support them. That's Iraq, Syria, and Iran. And the guy's nothing if not obsessive. And he's still trying to get us to fight Iran this day, this week. He's a deep, dark son of a bitch, sorry to tell you, because he's gotten us into endless wars, and because of the power of all of this in the U.S. politics, he's gotten his way. But that war was totally phony. So what is this democracy versus dictatorship? Come on, these are not even sensible terms.
This is Donald Trump sharing this video of Jeffrey Sachs. What does it mean, Senator, for the policy coming from Donald Trump and his administration in the West Asia?
Well, first of all, the things that Jeffrey Sachs describes, he does so with precision. Everything that he said is perfectly accurate. I began studying the war in Syria before it began because I was curious what we were doing launching an unprovoked attack on Libya. And as you know, we took the most prosperous, successful country in all of Africa, which was Libya, and turned it into an absolute wasteland, and it has never recovered. Nobody looks back and says, why did we do that? Why did we devastate a really fine, civilized nation and turn it into ashes? And why didn't we do something to help them when we were finished? But there were a couple of major reasons, but the principal reason for the United States getting involved was to capture the arsenal of weapons that we had sold. We knew that Libya had them because we sold them to them, and we looted the armories of Libya once we had organized terrorists to take over Benghazi, and we flew them from an airfield. We used transport jets from Qatar, and we had Turkish troops that manned the airfield, and the Qatari aircraft landed in Libya. They were loaded with modern advanced weapons. They were sent over to Turkey, where we had established a network of huge CIA-operated warehouses under what was then top secret program Timber Sycamore. That it was later revealed what that was about. Jeffrey Sachs mentioned Timber Sycamore. It was extremely important because this was the program by which the Central Intelligence Agency was tasked with overthrowing the legitimate, constitutionally elected government of Syria. And we supplied weapons to Al-Qaeda, to ISIS, to the entire terrorist network that ended up killing about 500,000 people in Syria. A tremendous number of them civilians, because by their nature, Al-Qaeda terrorists are willing to kill anyone who stands in their way. I probably watched 1,000 beheadings take place before all of a sudden there was a big move in the media to say, oh, we're going to upset people if we show these things. Well, it was fine to show them when we were trying to terrorize the nation of Syria to bring it down. Once the Syrian people rose up and fought back and blunted our efforts, then all of a sudden we decide, oh, we've got to erase this so that people won't recall what has been going on. You say that this video was released by the Trump administration, was it?
It was published by Donald Trump himself on his network, on his social network.
Okay, it's very surprising to me that he did that. Bibi Netanyahu controls American foreign policy in the Middle East. He doesn't precisely pick up the phone and say, I want 2 carrier task forces armed with this and that to report there in a week. He does it a little bit more indirectly, but if he wants carrier task forces in the Mediterranean, they will go there. And I'm not sure whether President Trump will be in a position to deny that or not. Now, the problem that we've got is that some of the people that President Trump has nominated for office are very much a part of the deep state, and Marco Rubio has been a very active proponent of the wars, whether they were in Ukraine, whether it's in the Middle East, wherever it is. He is not a peacemaker, and so it remains to be seen. I think that it is in Trump's heart that he would like to be known as a president who did not start any new wars on his watch. But it's a mistake to fail to understand that there is a power that is greater than that of the President of the United States. It is a global mechanism. It's more than just the internal bureaucracy in Washington, because it involves powers, immense banking powers in London, in Wall Street, and so the president only has so much authority, even when he wins a great electoral victory, as he did in this case. So it remains to be seen. I think one of the big challenges is going to be whether Trump is able to resist the siren call to start a great new war against Iran. Iran is desperate, absolutely desperate to stay out of war. And they did not reinforce Syria when Syria was threatened. I think they just made a hard decision and said, look, Netanyahu is desperate to see us do this. He wants to have some sort of a pretext to attack Iran. And I think they just made a very hard, emotionally difficult decision to abandon Syria. And this, everybody wants peace in the Middle East except Netanyahu. Netanyahu wants nothing but war. He wants to expand the borders of Israel as far as possible. He wants to take over most all of Syria and annex that land. He'd like to take over land in every direction. And he certainly sees no place in Israel for the Palestinian people, the indigenous people of the land, the people who lived there for many, many centuries before the European Jewish movement came after the Second World War, where Jewish people from many different countries decided to take residence in Palestine, and so it's been a very tragic move. It's caused nothing but slaughter and horror. There are elements within the United States who have been very instrumental in convincing Netanyahu to take on this hyper-aggressive policy against his neighbors. There's little doubt that the war against Iraq was a part of Netanyahu's plan. The war against Syria, the war against Libya. It's been a tremendous slaughter, and it's interesting. This most recent overthrow of the president of Syria and the legitimate government there. That was something that was certainly authorized by the White House in conjunction with Turkey, and certainly with Israel. And after 13 years of unremitting warfare and imposed famine, the nation of Syria, Syria had fought for 13 years successfully against 2/3 of the world's industrial and military might. You think of it, here's a small country of originally 23 million people withstanding 13 years of unremitting horror imposed by all of the great Western powers. And they did it because they were on the right side, because the people of Syria supported them. And then eventually, when John Kerry landed somewhere in the Middle East immediately after a great election victory for Bashar al-Assad, and when he did, he landed just briefly, long enough to dismiss this enormous effort that Syria had gone to conduct a fair and impartial election during wartime. And he said, that's nothing, that election doesn't mean anything. And then he said, we may need to move to Plan B. Now, he never announced formally, and I don't think the United States has ever announced formally what Plan B was. Plan B was very real. It wasn't just saying, well, we need to think of something different. They knew what they wanted to do. And what they did is the United States invaded northern Syria with no legal justification of any sort. It was just an out and out invasion. And we created this little rump state based on the theory that somehow Kurds, who were a minority up there, they deserved their own government, even though they were a minority. The Arabs were the majority up there. But we decided, well, the United States just think it'd be kind of nice to give Kurds a place of their own. Well, what we did it for is the wheat fields that feed all of Syria are in the north. The oil that provides 70% of Syria's export revenue is in the north. By sending our troops in and capturing that, Plan B was that we imposed a terrible famine on the people of Syria, so that they literally have starved. Some have starved to death since the time that we did this, and it's been going on for probably 5 years or more. And also we cut off all of their foreign revenue so that they couldn't pay for things. They couldn't pay for medications for people who were dying of cancer or needed operations. We cut them off from medical care. We cut them off from food. We cut them. There are cold winters in Syria. It's not overall a cold climate, but there are times it's very cold. And we had passed something called the Caesar sanctions. Many members of Congress voted in favor of it, and the president signed it. And the Caesar sanction actually, by their own terms, said that they were imposed to prevent Syria from rebuilding the war damage. Now, this is war damage that we caused. American taxpayer dollars paid for the shells and all the artillery shells and all the explosives that blew down half of all the buildings in Syria. And then we enacted the Caesar sanctions for the purpose of preventing them from being able to rebuild their country and rebuild what we had torn down. And so, as a consequence, in the winters, you would have elderly people who were just in some blown up building. They had made a little spot in all of the rubble, and they would literally freeze to death in the wintertime. Because it's hard for older, when you're 20 years old, you kind of figure something out. But when you're an old person, you don't have the ability to adapt, and physically you don't have the ability to adapt. And so the old people would simply freeze to death and die. And so this is the way that we finally beat down the people. And then I'm confident, while there's never been an announcement of this, but I'm quite confident that it was Biden's decision, the Biden administration decision, that they would simply inflame the entire world before President Biden left office on January the 20th. And so they began shipping all the arms they could to Ukraine to make sure that the slaughter continued there. And I think they finally made the decision that let's go ahead and let's just tear apart Syria and just leave chaos, so that President Trump could not bring peace to Syria, which is something he very much wanted to do in his first administration. And now it's left in chaos. You have a terrorist, Mohammed al-Jawlani. Up until a week after he took control, We had a $10 million bounty on his head because he led Al-Qaeda, the same group that flew the jets into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon on September 11th of 2001, killing 3,000 innocent Americans. And here we went crazy. Oh, we have to have a war on terror because of Al-Qaeda. And starting in 2011, we began to arm and supply and support Al-Qaeda, the same group, in every way. And we never stopped supporting them. And even though one hand of government put Mohammed al-Jilani on a $10 million bounty, he was on the most wanted list for the United States. The other part of the government, the CIA, the State Department, the very dark part of the deep state, they supported him and brought him into power. And then about a week after he took over, we just very quietly got rid of the $10 million bounty on his head.
Right now, Turkey, the United States, and Israel, right after the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, they said that they have defeated Russia and Iran in Syria, and Assad is gone. Yesterday, the Jerusalem Post reported, according to a government committee in Israel, it says that Israel must be prepared for a potential war with Turkey or Turkey in Syria. Here is the situation. Iran's gone. Russia, we can say they're not anymore in Syria. These are three countries that were interested in overthrowing Bashar al-Assad. Right now, the United States is fighting Turkey through the proxies in Syria. What's going on in your opinion? And is it going to be the new target for Netanyahu fighting Turkey? It's unbelievable.
Well, the problem for everyone is that Syria was a tremendous moderating influence. They were always opposed to terrorism. You would never know it from what you read in the news, but President Assad of Syria enacted under him, a new constitution was enacted, and it provided for equal rights for women. It provided freedom of religion in 3 different places, because I read the Constitution. It provided for freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Now, obviously, in wartime, some of those things, it's very hard to maintain those freedoms completely. But that was what he believed. Now, I met with President Assad twice. I met with him in his office. The first time I was able to meet with Bashar al-Assad and with his very lovely wife Asma, and now these two people, they never wanted to be in politics, but Bashar's older brother, who was sort of the heir to the power, he was killed in an auto accident. And Bashar's father called him back to Syria and said, this is your duty. You must serve the people. And so he did. Well, he was very westernized because Bashar al-Assad, he was being educated in England. His wife worked for Goldman Sachs. She was getting ready to go and take an MBA at Harvard. Extremely bright, both of them, extremely bright people. And so they had very westernized ideas. And they came back to Syria with the idea of being a reformist, with rooting out corruption, with improving the economy and sort of the living conditions for the ordinary people. They did a magnificent job. 10 years after Bashar al-Assad took office, Syria had the highest gross domestic product that it had ever had in its history. The economy was booming. Foreign investment was pouring in. The country was very successful. Everywhere there was sort of a liberalization, tremendous religious harmony among the people. People were very happy. Now there were pockets of dissidents where you had the most radical Islamic fundamentalists. You did have some people who grumbled about they didn't like Assad, but the Christians loved him. The Alawites, who are a very moderate, sort of a pro-Western group of Syrians, and the moderate Muslims. The Sunni Muslims made up about 70% of the entire population. So Bashar al-Assad could not have been successful if he hadn't appealed to the Muslims also. But the moderate Syrian Muslims supported him very strongly. And he was doing wonderfully until the decision was made that the United States was going to overthrow Syria. And this goes way back, right within about a year after the 9/11 attacks, which was 2001. There was a conversation overheard in which, in the Pentagon, they said, "Look, we're preparing to overthrow 7 countries in the next 5 years." And there was a list of them. They included Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, and then there's
Sudan, Somalia.
Sudan and Somalia. That's the list. And so this was well known within the Pentagon. It wasn't because they had done something to us, because they hadn't. Nobody in Iraq had done anything to the United States. The people who attacked the Pentagon and the Twin Towers, they all came from Saudi Arabia. I think a couple of them may have come from Egypt or somewhere, but almost all were Saudi Arabian. And I believe, honestly, that 9/11 was orchestrated by elements within the White House, elements within CIA, within the State Department. And back at that particular time, Saudi Arabia did not make a move in foreign affairs without American permission. They're a little different today, but back then they did not make the slightest move without our permission. And so the idea that all of these Saudis would come and fly and attack buildings in the United States without American permission, very, very difficult to believe. But it was necessary to carry out Netanyahu's vision for the Middle East, that there be a dramatic event, something that would just paralyze the whole country, and then the media could come in and start saying, "We've got to do something, we've got to do something." Well, if we were complicit in bringing about 9/11 with Saudi Arabia, we certainly were not going to attack Saudi Arabia, even though they were the people who attacked us. So we had to look for somebody else. And we had these countries that we had decided we're going to to take down. And Iraq happened to be one of them. Iraq had been an ally of the United States before we attacked them. We helped them in their war against Iran, which had been Iran had been taken over by a very, very radical, kind of a demonic Ayatollah, the Ayatollah Khomeini, not to be confused with the present Ayatollah Khamenei, who is a very moderate individual. He probably is getting nearing the end of his time. He's pretty elderly, but Iran today, and it's important for people to remember, what is a country today? What was it yesterday? And right after the Iranian Revolution, it was a horror story. Iran, was just executing untold thousands and thousands of completely innocent people. It was a revolution. And so this was the time when, with U.S. backing, Iraq launched a war against Iran. And then finally, after years and years of fighting, Iraq just began to run out of people. And so the United States, NATO, or somebody in that mix, the decision was made to provide poison gas to Iraq. And so poison gas was moved out of Europe and it was moved to Iraq. And it was old World War I stocks, mustard gas, chlorine gas, same stuff they used in World War I that just had remained in storage ever since then. And we sent it to Iraq. And at that time, Iran was starting to break through into Iraq, and they were sort of rolling up through the marshlands. And when we provided the poison gas, Iraq used it in huge amounts. This was not just some little incident somewhere. This was being used on an industrial scale. And the poison gas is what stopped Iran and ended the war. So we had provided weapons of mass destruction to Iraq, and not just a few. It was enormous quantities of poison gas. We provided poison bombs, where they could drop bombs by air. We had hundreds of thousands of poison gas artillery shells. And all this was provided by the West to Iraq. And then later on, we turned against Iraq at some point, not through no fault of their own. They did everything we asked them to do, but we just decided that it would be convenient to take them out. And so we began threatening, and we started talking about poison gas. Well, we turned against poison gas after they've been using it for years at our direction. And so Saddam Hussein got rid of all the poison gas to the point where when we finally went in and invaded Iraq, there was not a single shell. They couldn't find one single shell of poison gas. And I think that actually was stunning to President Bush and the people in the CIA and the State Department. They just figured, how in the world could they possibly get rid of every single shell and every trace of poison gas? But they did it. They were that serious about it. So our history in the Middle East is very dark. It might be one thing, at least you could explain it logically, if something we did had helped the people of the United States, if we had somehow gained something from it. But we didn't gain anything. The only people who gained were the Israelis. the Israelis got what they want. They weakened one more of their neighbors, and but it's tragic because so many millions of people have been slaughtered, and it's totally disconnected from the American people. The American people they're fed certain information, certain facts, but not all the facts. And then people say, yeah, okay, that sounds like the good guys are this way, the bad guys are that way. Yeah, maybe we ought to do something. So the American people are not bad people. The American people are very good people. They're decent. And if they know all of the facts, then it's very awkward for the deep state. It's hard for them when information breaks through. It was in 2015 when I wrote a letter to President Assad of Syria, and I told him I really was thanking the Syrian Arab Army, which had conducted a brilliant operation along the Kalaman mountain range, which separates Lebanon and Syria. And they had driven the terrorists out. Now, these are Al-Qaeda terrorists. And he had driven them out. And then they did this magnificent operation where the terrorists were holding 13 Catholic nuns as human hostages. And the intelligence service of Syria they discovered where they were. They were conducting a meeting. Somehow they went in, they rescued the 13 nuns, and where all of the terrorists were meeting, they planted explosives on every corner of the building. They blew down the building. They killed the whole bunch of them. And so I wrote a letter, and I told President Assad, I said, I want to thank the Syrian Arab Army for its gallant rescue of the 13 Catholic nuns and for clearing the Kalaman mountain range. Now, before they did this, there was an immense push by the terrorists, by Al-Qaeda and its allies, to conduct a campaign of rape. Now, this wasn't, when you have a war, you have characters who rape women occasionally, and that it's a terrible thing, but it happens in war. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about an army, Al-Qaeda, whose philosophy, whose religion and ideology compels them to commit rape against women and against children, against little girls who are 6 years old, who are 9 years old. And there were many reports coming out at the time, just before the Syrian operation to drive them out, where there were many of the Christian ladies who were committing suicide because they knew that when these CIA-backed armies came in, that they would be raped, and they just decided they would rather end their own lives than go through this. And so many of them did. Many of them just committed suicide. So this horror was going on with the full understanding and cooperation of the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department. And when I wrote this letter in 2015, it created just a global uproar. Here's one official, a state official in Virginia, who writes a letter, but the problem for them was that the letter showed tremendous insight. I understood precisely what was going on. And I said in the end of my letter, I said to President Assad, I said, I cannot explain to you why the United States, which was attacked by Al-Qaeda and lost 3,000 citizens on 9/11, has turned around and is now supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria. And we had hundreds of calls pouring in. The media, every news outlet, the Times, the Post, all of them, from Europe, from the United States, they were all calling into the office, demanding answers. And I set up a procedure. We had a very fine staff at the time. And I said, okay, I said, here's what we're going to do. I said, anybody who supports us, you make a list and thank them very much and tell them, we're firm in our position. Anybody who opposes us, put me on the phone and I'll talk to them. And I talked for the next 2 weeks. And I would say the majority of the people, once I explained to them what was going on, they changed sides. And then when I say majority, I would say probably at least 2/3 just completely changed sides. Then some others were just uncertain. They didn't know what to think. And there was only one person. He was a top person in Al Jazeera, and he was adamant. Now, Al Jazeera is in Qatar, and Qatar is the home base for the United States Central Command. So we have an enormous military presence in a country that really doesn't have much other than literally sand dunes and gas wells. And so we dominate Qatar, and through our pressure, Qatar was supplying arms to Al-Qaeda. And so the whole situation in the Middle East is based on illusions. None of it benefits the people of the United States. All of it is for the benefit of the most radical elements in Israel, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, who is one of the cruelest human beings on the planet, one of the cruelest who has ever lived on this planet. So that's where we are right now. Trump is going to have an enormous challenge, whether he can break the hammerlock that Netanyahu has over Congress. Congressman Massey has said that the Israelis have a person in every congressional office, apparently, except for his own. So how you break through that foreign influence, I don't know. But it will be a challenge for President Trump.
When you look at the situation in Ukraine, do you think that we are getting to a point that Donald Trump can put an end to the conflict? Or with I don't know if you know that just days ago, Ukrainians had attacked the Kursk region again.
Yes.
And it seems that they're trying to manipulate the situation. They're trying to show that we are going to fight Russians again and again. That doesn't matter, sending more aid to us. What's going on right now, in your opinion, under Donald Trump?
Well, now this is, I've followed the Ukraine war since before that began, going all the way back to when the United States overthrew the legitimate constitutionally elected government of Ukraine, and we put in place a revolutionary junta in Kiev, and then we began pouring massive amounts of weapons in to build up a powerful Ukrainian army to confront the Russian-speaking areas that had decided to break away. They hadn't signed on to be part of a country that was taken over by a revolutionary junta. And in the Donbass republics, Donetsk and Lugansk, those republics declared their independence, just as the colonies once declared their independence from Great Britain. And Crimea also declared its independence. And so we built up this huge army to attack the Russian-speaking areas. And they made war from 2014 on. They made war against the Donbass republics. 11,000 people were killed in those wars. And finally, they were getting prepared. They were amassing great forces to attack the Russian areas. These two republics had relatively small, poorly armed defense forces, and they were about to be just annihilated. And the Ukrainian army would have rolled right on to the Russian border and perhaps continued. Perhaps they wouldn't have stopped at the border. And at that point, President Putin and Ambassador Lavrov, one of the finest diplomats who's ever lived, they had been working desperately to avoid a war. And they had made it very clear to the United States, going all the way back to I think perhaps around 2007. They made it clear that if Ukraine became part of NATO, if they began to seriously look at becoming part of NATO, that was likely to force Russia into war. And so with all of this going on, President Putin had submitted detailed peace proposals to NATO. And he had said, look, let's talk about this. Let's don't go to war. And NATO just brushed it off like that was nothing. And at that point, President Putin looked and he saw this great Ukrainian army massed in preparation to attack the Donbass republics. And although the Russian army was quite unprepared for war, he decided that it was so essential to interrupt this buildup that he launched an attack. Now, typically, an attacker wants to have at least a 3-to-1 advantage over the defender. When President Putin ordered his attack, the defenders had a 3-to-1 advantage over the Russian troops. But he did it with the belief that if he didn't do it, and if he didn't break up their momentum towards war against the Donbass, then he would lose an opportunity, and they would roll right up to the Russian border. So he launched the attack under very, very restrictive rules of engagement, and he did not want people killed unnecessarily. He did not want property destroyed unnecessarily. And the Russians ran into immediate opposition. It was very, very heavy opposition, and the fighting was tougher than anticipated. But the Ukrainians were terrified by this new development. All of a sudden, Russia's coming across, and neither side wanted war. The Ukrainian people were so against war. The Russian people didn't want war. President Putin didn't want war. It was NATO and the United States that wanted the war. And so Zelensky and President Putin both sent peace envoys. They met, and 2 months after the war began, with very few casualties, with very little property damage, both sides had almost finalized an agreement. It was so favorable to both sides that the head negotiator went back to Kiev in Ukraine and announced, this is glorious. It looks like we're going to have peace. We've agreed on almost everything. And it was clear that both sides had great confidence. It was a win-win deal. It wasn't going to humiliate one side or the other. It was going to probably mean some loss of territory in the Russian speaking areas, but it was acceptable. And they were about to ink the final deal and make peace. And at that point, the United Kingdom, certainly in coordination with the White House, sent Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and he came and directed Zelensky to knock off these peace talks, made it clear we've got too much money riding on this war. There were great hedge funds that had placed big bets. There were major international banking interests out of London and out of Wall Street that saw the potential for enormous profits. And so Zelensky was told to, knock off this peace talk and let's get the war going. And that's what happened. And subsequently, who knows how many people have died. Certainly 500,000 people have died on both sides. 1 million is not out of the question. It's a tremendous death toll for both sides, and totally unnecessary. And interestingly, the United States, the American people had nothing to gain. Ukraine was not a vital American interest. We had never recognized it as having any special interest for the United States. Same thing really for Europe. It was these huge banking interests and these huge hedge funds placing their bets. I mean, truly evil, heartless people who, they don't care. Their wealth, their power is global, and they don't care if every man, woman, and child in Ukraine is dead before this is over. They really, literally don't care. And the same thing could be said of the people running the war out of the State Department, out of the Pentagon, out of the CIA. They don't care how many Ukrainians are killed. They just pressured Ukraine into lowering the age for the draft. And Ukraine, they've always had a population problem. Their population is dissipating. And so they were very protective of the younger men so that they'd sort of have some seed for the next crop of human beings, the next generation of Ukrainians. The United States put pressure on them, throw in the seed, burn through the seed, kill all the young men. And as long as you can keep this war going, perpetuate it. It was the decision of the Biden administration to throw everything they could in at the very end to make it more difficult for President Trump to extricate himself when the time came. I'm hopeful that President Trump will carry through on his promise. The other day, he made a very encouraging statement that he understood President Putin's reluctance to make peace with Ukraine joining NATO, because that's really what started the whole war, is that Ukraine was going to join NATO, which meant that NATO nuclear missiles would be right on the Russian border within 3 or 4 minutes of striking Moscow. That's what we wanted to do. We wanted to move nuclear power, nuclear weapons further towards Moscow so that we would be in a position to launch a nuclear Pearl Harbor. And so So where Trump ends up now, he's selected certain people who are fairly sympathetic to what has gone on in the past. And one of the things that's troubling to me is that he selected Keith Kellogg, retired General Kellogg, as his peace negotiator. Well, General Kellogg has been very sort of contemptuous of Russia as a country, sort of, talking about them in very demeaning ways that they really don't amount to much, but just sort of an army and a bunch of gas stations or oil wells. It's just nonsense, because there's no nation that has more natural resources than Russia, which is the reason that it hasn't collapsed. They grow their own food, they make their own fertilizer, they make steel, they export timber, they make machinery, they make everything. And so it's troubling when you have somebody who is not inclined towards peace, who is the peace negotiator. I think it's going to be important that President Trump get on the telephone with President Putin. I should say this about Trump. He is an extremely good listener. And if he can avoid having his staff screen him from information, the best thing in the world is for him to pick up that phone, to talk with President Putin. And Trump is pretty good at seeing the world from the other guy's eyes, which is why, they worked so hard to prevent him from actually communicating with Putin the last time. But he needs to talk with Putin. Putin can make it crystal clear to him why they cannot have NATO on their border. And Trump will understand it once he hears it, not from his staff of all these deep state characters, but when he hears it from the other side, the guy who's on the ground. I think that's the best chance for peace, is for Trump to get on the phone with President Putin, not for a 30-minute talk, but for a series of discussions about what should be done and why, what the rationale is. And I think ultimately what they need to do is for Ukraine to become a neutral country, just like Austria did during the Cold War. Austria was the only country along the Iron Curtain that was demilitarized. And they passed amendments to their constitution. They said that by constitution, Austria would be a neutral country from that time forward, and it would not allow stationing of any foreign troops in the boundaries of Austria. I visited Austria at the height of the Cold War, when there were tremendous tensions, and there were guns bristling on each side, and we were toe to toe with the Soviet Union. And when I drove into Austria, I was just stunned. Here, everybody is celebrating Christmas. The city in Vienna, where we went, the city's lit up. People are joyous. They're happy. I mean, I can't think. It was so dramatic. I was so accustomed to the Iron Curtain, and all of a sudden it was like the lights of the world had come on in Austria. And I didn't understand all the background at that time. I just knew that, wow, something incredible is taking place in this country. So this could be Ukraine. Ukraine could be like Austria. It could become a magnificent, joyous place where the Ukrainian expatriates would want to return to the country. They would want to participate in rebuilding. Where Russia, the most logical country to help with the rebuilding. Now, I'm not talking about being forced. I'm talking about economically helping would be Russia. Russian businessmen could make deals with Ukrainian businessmen where both sides benefit. And of course, that's the most healthy thing, not some kind of a welfare program, but a fundamentally beneficial economic system where Ukraine works with Russia and begins to conduct trade the way that it always had. So there are tremendous possibilities, and it's a question of whether the deep state can overwhelm Trump. I'm betting on Trump. My guess, I can't tell you that Trump is going to prevail in the Middle East, but I think he is going to prevail in Ukraine. I think he will end the war in a way that will be satisfactory to the Russians. It may take a little getting used to for the Ukrainians, but I think it's not going to take long before they're saying, wow, unbelievable what we just went through. And what did we do this for? For NATO, for some kind of airy principles that, why did I give up my son? Why did my daughter lose her life? It's insane what took place in Ukraine, and it's a measure of the tremendous force of evil in the deep state, the globalist deep state. It exerts enormous power. It's never working on behalf of something good. It is always invariably on the side of evil. And I hope we can break loose of it.
Hope so, Senator. I think he has the opportunity to do that, and he has the power to do that. Let's see what he's going to get from the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you so much for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Okay, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.